When Danielle first picked up photography, I was her biggest cheerleader. It started small, a casual hobby she'd picked up during the pandemic to pass the time. At first, it was charming, even refreshing to see her so passionate about something new. She'd spend hours at the park, capturing the changing seasons, or experiment with portraits of our kids when they'd sit still long enough. But like many hobbies, this one started to grow legs, demanding more of her time and attention. "You're really getting good at this," I said one evening as she showed me a series of black and white shots she'd taken of downtown. The way her eyes lit up at my words was worth the late nights she spent editing photos on her laptop. Then came the workshops. "I'm signing up for a photography class downtown," she announced one morning over coffee. "It's taught by this amazing professional photographer. Everyone says he's the best." His name was Julian. I remember the way she spoke about him that first day, like he was some kind of genius who held the key to unlocking her potential. I didn't think much of it. Who wouldn't admire someone great at what they did? But weeks into her classes, I started noticing subtle changes. Danielle was staying out later than usual. "We had an outdoor shoot that ran long," she'd explain, always with a laugh that felt just a bit too practiced. I told myself it was nothing, just her newfound passion taking hold. But then there were the weekends, the sudden, unplanned excursions where she'd leave early and come back hours later, exhausted but evasive. It wasn't until one Saturday morning, when she left her camera bag open on the kitchen counter, that I began to feel the first real stirrings of unease. I don't know what compelled me to look. It felt wrong, invasive even. But something about the way she'd hurried out the door left a knot in my stomach. Inside the bag, buried beneath filters and lens caps, was her camera. Curious, I powered it on and flipped through the images. At first, they were what I expected. Landscapes, candid shots of strangers, artistic attempts to capture light and shadow. But then, I found something that stopped me cold. There, amidst the artful compositions, were photos of Danielle. She wasn't the one behind the camera in these. Someone else was. The shots were intimate, but not in an overtly inappropriate way. They captured her laughing, tilting her head just so, her smile radiant and playful. She looked alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. And then, I saw him. Julian. The next photo was of him standing next to Danielle, his arm casually slung over her shoulders. It wasn't the pose that got me. It was the look on his face. He was smiling, sure, but there was something in his expression that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't jealousy I felt in that moment. It was the first crack in the wall of trust I'd built around us. I couldn't get the image out of my head. Danielle and Julian, standing so close, like they shared some private joke the world wasn't meant to hear. I told myself it didn't mean anything. After all, Julian was her teacher. He probably did this with all his students. But the thought wouldn't let go. The next time Danielle came home late, I couldn't help myself. "How was the shoot?" I asked, keeping my tone casual as she walked in. Her face flushed from the cold and something else I couldn't place. "Long," she replied, kicking off her shoes and avoiding my eyes. "Julian really pushes us to experiment with lighting. We spent hours trying to get this one shot right." She smiled as she said his name, and I felt my chest tighten. "Oh, yeah?" I asked. "What kind of shot?" Danielle paused, as if she hadn't expected me to ask. "Just a portrait," she said, waving it off. "Nothing special." Then she grabbed her bag and headed upstairs before I could press further. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while Danielle's even breathing filled the room. I thought about the photos on her camera, about the way she'd started guarding her phone like it held state secrets. I didn't want to be paranoid, but something felt off, different in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. The next morning, she was up early, humming to herself as she packed her gear. "Another shoot today?" I asked, trying to sound interested rather than suspicious. "Yeah," she said brightly. "Julian wants us to do some urban shots downtown. Should be fun." I watched her carefully as she spoke, looking for any sign that she might be lying. But she was good, too good. "Have fun," I said, forcing a smile as she kissed me on the cheek and headed out the door. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my jacket. I had no plan, just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't want to believe my wife was capable of betrayal, but I needed to know the truth. I drove downtown, parking a few blocks away from where her class was supposed to meet. It didn't take long to spot them. Danielle was there, her camera slung around her neck, laughing at something Julian had said. There were other students milling around, but they might as well have been invisible. Danielle and Julian were locked in their own little world. I watched as he leaned in, his hand brushing hers, and something inside me snapped. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed proof. Evidence that couldn't be explained away with excuses about photography techniques or group projects. So, I waited, keeping a safe distance as they moved from location to location. And then it happened. As the class began to break up, I saw Julian gesture toward a nearby cafe. Danielle hesitated, glancing around like she knew she shouldn't, but then she followed him. I parked across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Through the cafe window, I watched as they sat at a small table, leaning in close, talking and laughing like old friends. Julian reached across the table, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Danielle didn't pull away. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't enough. Not yet. I stayed in my car, watching the scene unfold through the cafe window. They looked so comfortable together, too comfortable. Danielle's expression was one I hadn't seen in years. Relaxed, radiant, like she didn't have a care in the world. I hated that it wasn't me putting that smile on her face. After about an hour, they got up to leave. Julian opened the door for her, his hand lightly touching the small of her back. My heart pounded as I watched them walk down the street, talking like they had all the time in the world. I followed at a safe distance, weaving through the crowds as they made their way to a nearby park. Julian carried her camera bag now, slung casually over his shoulder, while Danielle gestured animatedly, her hands moving as she explained something I couldn't hear. They stopped near a cluster of trees, and I ducked behind a bench, pretending to check my phone. Julian leaned against a tree while Danielle took a few steps back, her camera in hand. She snapped a picture, then another, laughing as she showed him the display. He stepped closer, brushing her arm as he reached for the camera. She didn't move away. It was like watching a movie in slow motion, one I wanted to walk out of but couldn't. When they finally said their goodbyes, Julian leaned in and kissed her cheek. I held my breath, waiting to see how she'd react. To my relief, Danielle didn't reciprocate, at least, not in a way that suggested anything more than friendly affection. But even so, the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with questions. Was I overreacting? Was I reading too much into a close friendship between a teacher and his student? Or was this the beginning of something more? Danielle got home late that evening, her face flushed from the cold. She set her bag down by the door and smiled at me like nothing was wrong. Long day? I asked, keeping my tone even as I sipped my coffee. Yeah, she said, sinking into the couch with a sigh. We did some really cool shots downtown. Julian had this idea for capturing reflections in puddles. It was amazing. I nodded, pretending to listen as she went on about lighting angles and aperture settings. But all I could think about was the cafe, the park, the way Julian had kissed her cheek. Sounds like you had fun, I said when she finally paused to catch her breath. She smiled, leaning her head back against the cushion. I did. It's nice to feel creative again, you know? Like I'm actually doing something for me. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was that what this was about? Had I been so focused on work and the kids that I'd forgotten to make her feel valued? But even as the guilt crept in, a darker thought took hold. If she was unhappy, why didn't she talk to me about it? Why turn to Julian instead? That night, I decided to dig deeper. While Danielle slept, I slipped downstairs and grabbed her camera back. I felt a pang of guilt as I unzipped it, but I couldn't stop myself. The photos on her memory card told a story I wasn't ready to hear. There were dozens of shots from the day, urban landscapes, candid portraits of strangers, and artistic compositions that showcased her growing talent. But then there were the photos of Julian. In one, he leaned against a lamppost, his head tilted slightly as he smiled at the camera. In another, he sat on a bench, his gaze soft and contemplative. And then there was the last photo, One of him and Danielle together, their faces close, their smiles wide. I stared at the screen, my heart sinking as I tried to make sense of it all. Was this just a harmless friendship, or was there something more? I put the camera back in her bag and sat down at the kitchen table, my head in my hands. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure how to fix it. The next morning, Danielle acted as if everything was normal. She kissed me on the cheek before rushing out the door, her camera bag slung over her shoulder and her hair tied back in a messy bun. "Don't wait up," she called out. "I'll probably be late again." I nodded absently, my coffee untouched on the counter. My mind was racing, consumed by the images from her camera and the gnawing uncertainty that refused to let me rest. After she left, I grabbed my phone and opened a browser. I searched for Julian's name, hoping to find something that would help me make sense of his role in Danielle's life. His website popped up almost immediately. Slick, professional, filled with glowing testimonials and galleries of his work. But then I found something else, his social media. Scrolling through his posts, I came across photos that made my blood run cold. There she was, Danielle, smiling radiantly in a black and white portrait he'd posted just 2 days ago. The caption read, "Incredible talent meets unfiltered passion. Some muses just make the art effortless." Muse. The word hit me like a freight train. Was that what she was to him? A muse? A creative spark? Or was it something more? I kept scrolling, my chest tightening with every post. There were more photos of Danielle, scattered throughout his feed, each one accompanied by captions that felt more personal than professional. "Eyes that see the world differently," read one. "Strength and vulnerability," read another. I couldn't take it anymore. I closed the app and tossed my phone onto the couch, my hands shaking. By the time Danielle got home that evening, I'd managed to pull myself together, or at least I thought I had. "How was the shoot?" I asked as she walked in, her cheeks pink from the cold. "It was great," she said, setting her bag down. Julian had this idea for using natural light in alleyways. It turned out amazing. She smiled as she spoke, but I couldn't help noticing the way she avoided my eyes. "Must be nice," I said casually, "having someone so talented to guide you." Danielle paused, her smile faltering just slightly. "Yeah," she said after a moment. "He's really good at what he does." Her words were harmless, but the way she said them, the softness in her voice, the faint smile tugging at her lips, made my stomach churn. That night, as she slept, I made a decision. I needed answers. Real answers. The next day, while Danielle was out, I logged into our shared phone account and pulled up her call history. It didn't take long to find Julian's number. It was everywhere. Missed calls, outgoing calls, texts at all hours of the day and night. I clicked on the text log, my heart racing as I scrolled through the timestamps. The messages were frequent, far more than I'd expected. And then, I saw one that made my breath catch. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." It was dated 2 weeks ago, on a night Danielle had told me she was out on a late shoot. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. I didn't need to read the actual messages to know what was going on. The truth was staring me in the face, undeniable and cruel, but I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more than call logs and gut feelings. I needed proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. That evening, while Danielle was in the shower, I slipped into her office and found her laptop. She was careful about her phone, always keeping it locked or within arm's reach, but her laptop was a different story. I opened it and navigated to her email. It was logged in. What I found confirmed everything I feared. There were dozens of emails between Danielle and Julian, each one more intimate than the last. They weren't explicit, but the tone was unmistakable. Inside jokes, personal confessions, plans to meet up outside of class. And then there were the photos. Attachments she'd sent him, photos of herself that weren't meant for me. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, as the realization sank in. Danielle wasn't just hiding something. She was actively betraying me. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring blankly at the flickering glow of the laptop screen. Danielle was upstairs, humming softly as she got ready for bed, completely unaware of the storm brewing below. I replayed the emails in my mind, over and over, like some terrible song I couldn't get out of my head. The way she spoke to Julian was so warm, so familiar, like she'd known him for years, not months. And those photos, I couldn't unsee them. They weren't inappropriate, not overtly, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the way she posed. It was the way she looked into the camera, like she was showing him a part of herself I no longer got to see. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. I felt like a fool. How had I missed it? How long had this been going on while I sat here, playing the supportive husband? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Danielle's footsteps on the stairs. She walked into the kitchen, her face freshly washed, her hair damp, and smiled at me like everything was fine. "You okay?" she asked, pouring herself a glass of water. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She nodded, taking a sip before leaning against the counter. "I was thinking," she began, her voice casual, "maybe we could plan a weekend away soon. Just the two of us. It's been a while since we've done something together." I froze. A weekend away? Now? After everything I just uncovered? "Sure," I said, my voice tight. "That sounds nice." She smiled again, that same radiant smile I'd seen in Julian's photos, and for a moment, I felt like I was staring at a stranger. That night, I barely slept. Danielle's words kept playing in my head, their sweetness tainted by the bitterness of her betrayal. Was this her way of trying to assuage her guilt? Or was it just another performance in the carefully crafted lie she was living? By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront her yet. I still needed more. But I wasn't going to sit back and let this go on any longer. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. I tracked her movements, listened carefully to her stories, and quietly collected every piece of evidence I could. Every call, every text, every unexplained outing. It all went into a file I kept hidden on my own laptop. It didn't take long for my suspicions to be confirmed. One evening, when she said she was heading out for a late shoot, I decided to follow her. I kept a safe distance as she drove downtown, weaving through the streets with the kind of ease that came from familiarity. She wasn't going to a photo shoot. I could feel it. She parked outside a small, dimly lit restaurant and walked inside. I waited a few minutes before following, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I stepped inside, I saw them. Danielle and Julian were seated at a corner table, their heads close as they spoke in hushed tones. They looked completely at ease, like they'd done this 100 times before. I slipped into a booth near the back, far enough to avoid being seen but close enough to watch. They laughed, shared a bottle of wine, and even exchanged what looked like a small gift, Julian handing her a neatly wrapped box. Danielle opened it, her face lighting up as she pulled out what looked like a necklace. I clenched my fists under the table, my jaw tightening as I watched her slip it around her neck. She turned to Julian, her smile warm and unguarded, and I felt the last shred of denial I'd been holding on to crumble. This wasn't just a friendship. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was real that I stayed in that booth, frozen, watching them as the truth unfolded right in front of me. Danielle was laughing, her hand resting on Julian's arm like it belonged there. The way she looked at him, it was the kind of look I used to see when she looked at me. For a moment, I thought about storming over, flipping the table, and demanding answers right there in the restaurant. But I held back. Losing my temper wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't fix this, and it wouldn't give me the leverage I needed. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos, my hands shaking as I tried to keep the camera steady. Proof. Cold, undeniable proof of what was really going on. I didn't wait for them to leave. As soon as I had what I needed, I slipped out of the restaurant and drove home in silence, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. By the time Danielle got back that night, I was sitting in the living room, staring at the photos on my phone. She walked in, humming softly to herself, and set her bag down by the door. "Hey," she said, smiling as she kicked off her shoes. "You're up late." "Couldn't sleep," I replied, my voice calm, almost detached. She paused, her smile faltering slightly. "Everything okay?" I looked at her for a long moment, wondering how she could stand there, so carefree, so oblivious, after everything she'd done. "Yeah," I said finally, forcing a small smile. Just work stuff. You know how it is. She nodded, relaxing as she walked over and kissed my cheek. Don't stress too much. You need to take care of yourself. The irony of her words made my stomach turn. That night, I lay awake, replaying the events of the evening in my mind. Every laugh, every touch, every glance they'd shared at that table. It all played on a loop, taunting me. By morning, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to sit by and let her destroy our marriage without consequences. If she wanted to throw everything away for Julian, fine. But she wasn't going to walk away unscathed. The next day, while Danielle was at another shoot, I started putting my plan into motion. First, I called a private investigator. I'd seen enough movies to know that the evidence I had so far wouldn't hold up if things escalated to court. I needed more, something concrete, something indisputable. The PI I hired was efficient, professional, and discreet. He assured me he'd have everything I needed within a week. In the meantime, I started preparing for what came next. I went through our finances, pulling records, documenting every shared asset, and quietly moving my own savings into a separate account. I wasn't about to let Danielle walk away with a dime more than she deserved. I also made copies of the photos and emails I'd found, storing them on a secure drive. If Danielle tried to deny anything, I'd be ready. And then, I waited. For the next few days, I kept up the act, playing the part of the loving, oblivious husband while secretly tracking every move she made. I didn't ask where she was going or who she was with. I didn't press her when she came home late, smelling faintly of wine and perfume. But inside, I was seething. Every laugh, every lie, every stolen moment she shared with Julian only fueled my resolve. She thought she was untouchable, that I was too blind or too weak to do anything about it. She had no idea what was coming. The private investigator didn't take long to deliver. Within a week, he handed me a folder thick with evidence, timestamps, photographs, and even receipts that tied Danielle and Julian together more intimately than I could have imagined. I sat alone in my car after our meeting, flipping through the photos with a mix of anger and numb acceptance. There were pictures of them walking hand in hand in a park, sneaking glances at each other over coffee, and even one of Danielle leaning against Julian in what looked like a quiet embrace. But what struck me most were the hotel records. There it was in black and white, multiple stays at a boutique hotel just outside of town. Dates and times matched perfectly with the nights she'd claimed to be out on late shoots. As I stared at the folder, my mind raced. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to throw the evidence on the table and demand she admit what she'd done. But another part of me knew that wasn't enough. I needed more than a confession. I needed to make sure she couldn't manipulate her way out of this. I wasn't just going to end things. I was going to end them on my terms. That night, I stayed up late, going through the evidence again and again, crafting my plan down to the smallest detail. Danielle had made a fool of me for long enough. It was time to remind her who she was dealing with. The next morning, Danielle was unusually cheerful. She hummed as she made coffee, scrolling through her phone with a soft smile on her face. "What's got you in such a good mood?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She glanced up, startled, before quickly composing herself. "Oh, nothing," she said with a shrug. "Just excited about the shoot today. Julian's got some big plans for us." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's great," I said, forcing a smile of my own. "You're really lucky to have a mentor like him." She nodded, her face brightening. "Yeah, I am. He's inspiring." I bit back the bitter retort that rose in my throat and instead said, "You should invite him over for dinner sometime. I'd love to meet the man who's had such a big impact on you." Danielle froze for a split second, her hand tightening on her coffee mug. Yeah, she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Maybe someday." I let the conversation drop, but inside, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. She was nervous. Good. Over the next few days, I continued to play the part of the oblivious husband, all while setting my plan into motion. I met with a divorce attorney, laying out everything I'd gathered and outlining my goals. Full control of our shared assets, no alimony, and an airtight case that left her with as little leverage as possible. The attorney was impressed. "You've done your homework," she said, flipping through the photos and documents. This is more than enough to make your case. But are you sure you want to go this route? Divorce can get messy. I nodded, my resolve unshaken. She made it messy the moment she decided to lie to me. The lawyer agreed to start drafting the paperwork immediately, but she offered one last piece of advice. When you confront her, stay calm. The evidence speaks for itself. Don't let her emotions derail the process. I thanked her and left, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The confrontation was coming, and I needed to be ready. That evening, I prepared everything I would need. The evidence folder sat on the dining table, neatly organized and impossible to ignore. I poured myself a drink and waited, my heart pounding as the clock ticked closer to the moment of truth. When Danielle finally walked through the door, her laughter still lingering from whatever joke she and Julian had shared before she left him, I knew it was time. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down. "What's for dinner?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm but firm. She hesitated, her smile faltering. "Okay, about what?" I gestured to the table, where the folder sat waiting like a bomb ready to detonate. "About this." Her eyes flicked to the folder, her expression shifting from confusion to panic in an instant. "What is that? Why don't you open it and find out?" I said, leaning back in my chair, my gaze never leaving hers. Danielle stood frozen, her hand hovering above the folder. Her face had gone pale, her usual composure crumbling as she hesitated. "Ethan, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You tell me," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Go ahead, Danielle. Open it." Slowly, she reached for the folder and flipped it open. Her eyes scanned the photos, the hotel receipts, and the printed emails. The room was so silent I could hear the rustling of paper as she flipped through each page. When she finally looked up, her face was a mixture of guilt and defiance. "You've been spying on me?" "Don't turn this around," I said sharply. "This isn't about me. It's about you, about Julian, about the lies, about what you've been doing behind my back." Her lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time, she didn't have an excuse ready. "How long, Danielle?" I asked, leaning forward. "How long have you been lying to me?" She looked away, her shoulders slumping as she whispered, "It's not what it looks like." "Don't insult me," I snapped. "I've got photos, emails, hotel receipts. So why don't you just tell me the truth for once?" Her silence spoke volumes. Finally, Danielle let out a shaky breath and sank into a chair. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said quietly. "Julian and we connected. It started with the photography, but then..." "Then what?" I demanded, my voice rising. "You decided I wasn't enough? That you'd rather spend your nights in hotel rooms with him?" "It wasn't like that," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Spare me," I said coldly. "You didn't think about me at all, or our family, or what this would do to us." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing, but I didn't feel sympathy. "Not anymore. I've already talked to a lawyer," I said, my voice hard. "Divorce papers will be ready by the end of the week. You'll get what you deserve, nothing more." Her head shot up, panic flashing in her eyes. "Divorce? Ethan, no. Please, we can fix this. I'll end it with Julian. I'll do whatever it takes." "It's too late," I said, standing. "You made your choice, Danielle. Now you have to live with it." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the weight of her betrayal sinking in like a stone in my chest. Over the next week, the cracks in our marriage became chasms. Danielle tried to salvage what she could, constantly apologizing, begging for forgiveness. But her words felt hollow, meaningless. Meanwhile, I made sure to protect myself. I locked down our finances, ensured the house was in my name, and prepared for the legal battle ahead. And Julian? He stayed out of sight, though I knew from the investigators' reports that he and Danielle were still in contact. She thought she could have it both ways. She was wrong. The moment came when I decided it wasn't enough to simply walk away. Danielle and Julian had humiliated me, destroyed the life we'd built together. They needed to feel the consequences. Using the investigators' evidence, I leaked the story of their affair to Julian's photography community, discreetly, of course. Word spread like wildfire. Clients pulled out of deals, his reputation took a hit, and the prestigious gallery that had been planning to feature his work quietly dropped him from their schedule. Danielle's reaction when she found out was priceless. "Why are you doing this?" she screamed, tears of anger streaming down her face. "Because you deserve it," I replied simply. When the divorce papers arrived, Danielle seemed like a shell of the woman I'd once known. She tried to negotiate, to cling to what little dignity she had left, but my lawyer made sure she walked away with nothing more than her clothes and personal belongings. "I thought you loved me," she said during our final conversation. "I did," I replied, my voice cold. "But you killed that love the moment you decided I wasn't enough." She packed her things and left the house that same night and the weeks that followed. I started to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the pain of her betrayal hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping for air. But I refused to let it break me. I threw myself into my work, spent more time with friends, and even picked up a new hobby, something I'd always wanted to try but had put off for years. Slowly but surely, I felt the weight lifting. One evening, months after Danielle had left, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching the sunset with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that. Danielle and Julian had taken a lot from me, but they hadn't taken everything. I still had my strength, my dignity, and the knowledge that I could overcome anything life threw at me. Revenge had been sweet, but the real victory was in reclaiming myself, and that was a story I intended to continue writing, one day at a time.